Ever notice how, in some of the most heavily impacted regions across the globe, invasive species seem nearly impossible to manage? Governments have poured billions into eradication programs. Yet these efforts barely make a dent in the overall numbers. This pattern might lead you to think that dropping any foreign animal into a new ecosystem practically guarantees it'll explode in population and wreak havoc. But here's the surprising twist. That's actually the opposite of what usually happens. There's a well-known ecological principle called the TENS rule, which suggests that roughly 10% of introduced species actually escape into the wild. About 10% of those escapees manage to establish stable populations, and only 10% of those established species end up becoming invasive problems. Throughout history, humans have made countless blunders by releasing non-native animals into places where they absolutely don't belong. But fortunately, in certain instances, those attempts completely flopped. In today's video, we're diving into exactly those kinds of stories. We'll be examining several examples from around the globe where specific species totally failed to become invasive threats. We're covering creatures both massive and tiny, and to kick things off, we're heading offshore to the stunning Hawaiian Islands. Similar to many other island chains around the world, Hawaii has become a major hotspot for invasive species. Countless different animals were introduced here to address various problems. But like so many other animal introductions, they ended up creating more issues than they solved. Mongooses and cats cause significant problems here, but so do large mammals, including deer, pigs, and sheep. These grazing animals wreak havoc on native plants and can also negatively affect water quality and watershed health. Numerous large mammal introductions have succeeded here, but there was one that seemed to fail for no clear reason whatsoever. Back in November 1959, 56 pronghorn were captured from the plains of Montana, and their next stop was the Hawaiian island of Lanai. Tragically, while crossing the Pacific by ship, they encountered a severe storm, and 12 pronghorn were lost during transit. Once they finally reached Hawaii, some were sent to a zoo in Honolulu, while the rest were transported to Lanai. There wasn't any specific reason behind introducing these animals. Instead, it appears the government simply wanted to establish game species in Hawaii. This was the same motivation behind bringing multiple deer species to the Hawaiian Islands, despite the fact they can have enormously negative effects on native species. After their final uncomfortable journey from Honolulu, the pronghorn were released onto 35 square miles of open grassland. Initially, they began doing reasonably well in their new habitat. There were a few setbacks, such as when some pronghorn drank seawater and became severely dehydrated, while others panicked and jumped into the ocean. Eventually, they were herded to higher elevation, away from danger. Because of their traumatic experience combined with drinking salt water and developing eye infections, more pronghorn died. After just 1 month, only 18 animals remained. Despite everything they'd endured, the surviving 18 pronghorn began to thrive, and year after year, their numbers grew. By 1966, they had reached a population exceeding 250 on the island, and the experiment appeared to have succeeded despite all the obstacles. However, during the 1970s, the pronghorn population suddenly started collapsing, and the precise reason behind this decline remained unclear. Some suggested that Hawaiian grass wasn't nutritious enough for pronghorn. Whatever the true cause was, it resulted in their complete disappearance by 1985. Even though pronghorn are beautiful, distinctive animals, they're not suited for island living, and it's probably better for the ecosystem that they eventually vanished. For our next section, we're taking the relatively brief trip across to Australia, which has gained worldwide notoriety for some of the absolute worst animal introduction decisions ever made. Before we fully understood how devastating non-native introductions could be to natural ecosystems, bringing in foreign species was often viewed as an effective and fairly cheap solution to various problems. Got an insect problem? Bring in toads, dealing with out-of-control rabbit populations? Introduce foxes, Both of these cases rank among Australia's most disastrous historical blunders. However, another potentially invasive species completely failed to survive there. Mongooses have been released into numerous countries worldwide, and once they establish themselves, they become almost impossible to eliminate. Mongooses were brought to Hawaii specifically to deal with rats that were devastating sugarcane crops. Of course, rats aren't the only prey mongooses target. They're an exceptionally hardy and adaptable group of mammals, hunting basically anything smaller than themselves. They were released into many other island nations for identical reasons, and I actually managed to spot one myself during a trip to Mauritius. Given their dominance across so many island ecosystems, you'd naturally assume that if someone attempted to introduce them into Australia, they'd absolutely thrive there. Even though it's a relatively obscure story, there was indeed an attempt to bring these mammals into the country during the late 1800s. They were transported to Australia to help manage rats in sugarcane fields, but some believe they were also intended to control the rabbit populations across the country, which had grown into a massive problem. There are also claims they were brought to deal with Australia's deadly native snakes, though it's uncertain whether this was genuinely to reduce snake numbers or simply for entertainment purposes. Unlike the previous example, this wasn't some weak attempt involving just a handful of animals. Instead, it's believed that up to 1,000 mongooses were introduced into different regions across Australia. To this day, it remains somewhat mysterious why this introduction completely failed. Since it happened so long ago, much of the specific information has been lost to history. Some suggest that rabbit trappers may have deliberately killed them to protect their jobs, while others point out that certain semi-arid Australian regions were simply too harsh and different from their natural habitat. If they had managed to establish themselves, it would have been an absolute disaster, and countless native animals would have suffered severely. Small reptiles and amphibians would have been sitting ducks, and mongooses are notorious for raiding bird nests in other countries where they're invasive. It's possible that native large lizards could have preyed on them and kept their numbers in check. It's also possible they wouldn't have developed the same resistance to Australian snake venom that they possess in their native range. This is partly why the cane toad had such a devastating impact in Australia. Across their natural habitat, many predators evolved resistance to their toxins. But for Australian predators, cane toad poison was absolutely lethal. Thankfully, these aggressive mammals never managed to make Australia their permanent home, and the real reason behind this might remain a mystery forever. For our next section, we're heading over to North America to examine one of the largest invasive species in the world. Camels actually originated in North America more than 40 million years ago, and they only went extinct on the continent roughly 10,000 to 13,000 years ago. In evolutionary terms, that's barely any time at all, which suggests camels could potentially still survive in modern North America. It's widely believed that humans played a significant role in their extinction, similar to how we contributed to the disappearance of most of the world's megafauna during that period. Some people argue this makes it our responsibility to bring them back. I'd love to say that's why camels were introduced into the US back in the 1850s, but that's not exactly how the United States Army operates. Instead, the idea was that camels could help navigate the brutal landscapes of southwestern North America, and some even suggested they could potentially be used in military operations. Extensive discussions and planning went into bringing camels to North America, and eventually, in 1855, the U.S. Congress allocated $30,000 to the project. That's over $1 million in today's currency, which should have been more than sufficient to purchase several camels. Mostly dromedary camels, along with a few Bactrian camels, were shipped from the Mediterranean region to the U.S. During their journey, some animals died while some females gave birth. After 2 separate voyages, the U.S. Army had accumulated 70 camels, and a breeding program was being organized so the Army could utilize these desert specialists for desert exploration missions. During initial tests evaluating their effectiveness as pack animals in desert conditions, one Navy lieutenant declared he'd prefer one camel over 4 mules any day. So it appeared the project was heading toward massive success. If you know anything about American history, then you're probably aware of something else that occurred a few years after their arrival, and this event completely ended the experiment. When the Civil War erupted, all interest and funding for the project immediately ceased. Some camels were captured and sold off, while others were simply released into the wild. The animals that escaped could have potentially established themselves and become a genuine problem, but it seems they simply disappeared. The last wild camel sighting in Arizona was recorded in 1891, so they did manage to survive for at least several decades. Even though seeing camels roaming North America again would have been fascinating, they likely would have caused massive negative impacts on the ecosystem. In Australia, camels were introduced by the British for similar purposes, and when they were released, they successfully established themselves. Today, they continue causing significant problems. Despite multiple large-scale culling operations, their population remains robust, with over 1 million camels scattered across the country. You could argue that North America has more land predators that might have been able to effectively manage their numbers, and since they once lived here naturally, their environmental impact might not have been too severe. Of course, this introduction differs from all the others because there was never any intention for them to become part of the natural ecosystem. Ironically, this project started because of war and actually ended because of war as well. Perhaps it's fortunate they never established populations across the Southwest after all. We're going to continue our journey by heading to New Zealand, along with small mammalian predators creating chaos across the country. New Zealand also faces problems with numerous large herbivores. Over the years, 8 different deer species were introduced into New Zealand, but today only one of these species is no longer found there. The moose is easily the largest deer species in the world and ranks among the largest land animals alive today. Introducing a mammal this massive into an ecosystem with virtually no native mammals was bound to have a huge impact. The fact that a moose can consume up to 32 kilograms of food daily means they can absolutely devastate native plant life. The first moose introduction into the country happened in 1900 when 4 moose were released, but they failed to reproduce, and the last individual was shot in 1908 after becoming a nuisance in local gardens. 2 years later, in 1910, 10 moose were shipped from Canada to Fiordland, and this introduction proved much more successful. Later in 1923, it was reported that the moose were flourishing, and some individuals were even being hunted. Similar to the pronghorn story, this turned out to be a false dawn because their numbers began declining. There are several theories explaining why. Some suggest that even though Fiordland shares a similar climate with Alaska, it apparently didn't provide sufficient food to sustain these enormous mammals. The last confirmed moose sighting in New Zealand occurred in 1952. Yet still, their legend refuses to fade. Just like the thylacine story, many people refuse to accept that moose have gone extinct in New Zealand, and new claimed sightings seem to surface every year. It would be fascinating to discover that some moose managed to survive in Fiordland all this time, but at this point, it seems extremely unlikely. Despite their size, moose can be remarkably elusive animals, so maybe there's some slim hope they could still be out there somewhere. There's even a $100,000 reward for anyone who can provide proof of a living moose in the country. So if you genuinely believe they're still out there, maybe you should give it a shot and try tracking them down in the wild. We're going to wrap up this video in the same location, so for our final section, we're staying in New Zealand. These days, New Zealand faces enormous challenges with invasive species. And that's mainly because of 2 critical reasons. First, New Zealand spent millions of years cut off from the rest of the planet, creating a completely isolated island ecosystem. Second, when European settlers arrived, they had this habit of bringing along all sorts of random animals, since the country had virtually no native land-based predators and barely any native land mammals whatsoever. introducing a predatory land mammal here would be one of the absolute worst moves imaginable. Unfortunately, that's precisely what European colonizers did, and the consequences for native wildlife were absolutely catastrophic. During the late 1800s, several weasel species were brought in, supposedly to tackle the exploding rabbit population, which was itself a problem Europeans had already created. The majority of New Zealand's native wildlife consists of insects, reptiles, and various bird species. Since many of these birds are flightless, they became incredibly easy targets for these newly arrived mammalian hunters. There's an extensive list of unique species we'll never get the chance to see again because of these reckless introductions. The fact that Europeans made such careless choices that resulted in extinctions is terrible enough on its own. But if one additional introduction attempt had actually worked out, the damage could have been catastrophically worse. Way back in 1864, a single pair of red foxes was released somewhere on the South Island. Thankfully, they completely failed to establish a breeding population. The fact that they didn't make it really shouldn't shock anyone, considering successful introductions typically require dozens of animals. At minimum, those two foxes probably had an incredible time hunting defenseless native wildlife with zero effort. But two individuals simply isn't enough genetic diversity to build a viable population. Even if they managed to reproduce, their offspring would have faced extremely slim survival odds due to severe inbreeding issues. While unlikely, it wasn't completely outside the realm of possibility that they could have taken hold. After all, in Finland, the entire non-native white-tailed deer population, which now exceeds 100,000 individuals, originated from fewer than 10 animals. It's genuinely fortunate that those foxes failed their invasion attempt and nobody tried again, because if they had succeeded in becoming established, the result would have been an incredibly long list of extinct species. All you have to do is glance at Australia to understand the destruction red foxes can cause. They were introduced there during the late 1800s, and today their population sits around 1.7 million individuals spread across the entire continent. Their takeover directly led to the extinction of numerous native marsupials, and now they're virtually impossible to control. Fortunately, following that failed attempt, New Zealand's government recognized that allowing foxes to establish would pose a massive danger to native animals. They promptly banned the importation of these highly adaptable canines. So even though it was a poorly planned attempt with terrible execution, the potential consequences could have been enormous. If it had succeeded, there's a real possibility we wouldn't be able to observe some of the country's most recognizable animals today. Thanks to those of you who contributed to the research for this video. Some of these stories came from your suggestions. Feel free to share your thoughts and suggestions below. But for now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.